Okay, come in, sit down. I've got a rambling video about some accessibility things. I was looking over the 2019 article on the matuzo.at site, which is very useful, where he attempted to build the most inaccessible site possible with a perfect Lighthouse score, which turns out is quite straightforward. He got a 100 score for accessibility despite making a site that was completely unusable. So it's just really funny. I suppose it's a bit of a dig at that kind of score system, where it's clearly got some issues because it's enabled some quite base stuff to get through. But I thought by seeing some of the things that he did, it kind of teaches you a bit about the setup. So the first thing you can do is set a hidden on the body, and there you go. You've just made an unusable website out the box, and it won't catch that. You'll get 100, and if you can then reset it with some CSS, you'll still get a site, but it's definitely not usable because now it requires CSS straight away. HTML by default is accessible, so by sort of as soon as you start actually creating content, that's where you create the problems. And by making users need CSS, so it's just worth thinking about that. If anything on your site is like, it won't display properly with regular HTML, you need CSS for this thing to format, or this thing to display, or these colors to match. So if anything you've done is somehow broken without CSS, you've straight away made an inaccessible site. The more common one, he did the same with JS, is that you need JS on the page to add the loaded class, to add the style, to make the thing display. So it's probably incredibly common because of the amount of frameworks out there, that if your site doesn't work at all with JavaScript, then you've got a fairly inaccessible site. And there's some sort of percentage which is like not high, but it's higher than you imagine, that people that don't have JS enabled on their browsers. It's difficult because of really any functional, any practical website that does something, you feel like it's going to have some sort of JavaScript. So, and versus anything that's like a super static blog, but anything that's like it has a login system, or has enables people to actually add products to a basket, or to download items, anything really. It's just very hard to do anything without JavaScript. But I suppose having a fallback, just at least testing what you do, is quite useful. Screen reader, so you can mess with ARIA hidden on the body, and you can make that disappear. Obviously the old focus outline, you can mess up with people there. You can also just use JavaScript to just mess with people on events, so they can't type anything. You can mess with the contrast, and you could just set the background and the colors to both be the same color. There you go. You can just make it so no one can ever read the content. Remove the hover. This is interesting because up till now you kind of feel like, well, these are all things that I wouldn't get caught out because my browser does have JavaScript, and I could probably just select the text. But suddenly you're like, oh, hold on, if you can't view the cursor, now it would be quite hard to do things on this. You might be able to get around it somehow. Then just stop pointer events, stop things being able to happen. Low opacity. And they say, oh, somehow, actually, if you went to a screen reader mode in Safari, you can still see this thing, so it's fine. But if you just set a really small font size, then that will just mess that up. It also converts the text to HTML entities. So similarly, if you thought, well, I'll just use view source and I'll view the content that way. No, it's also converted. So now it's super inaccessible, and it scored 100. Well, it's interesting. I think he makes the point of saying with this that it's not to sort of embarrass Lighthouse and Google. I think it's just that thing of, I think somehow that Lighthouse system has got into a way of gamifying it, and that people can just say like, well, we'll deliver a site which scores 100 in Lighthouse, as if to say, so that's checkbox done. And you're kind of just saying it's a yes no about is it accessible or not. The same way that you say, oh, well, our performance is 100 in Lighthouse, and it could still actually be quite slow because of background tasks, or because of the actual content that's relevant comes in at a later point. You can find ways to sort of beat the system and score. I think it's mentioned is they said that if you add hidden, it removes it from the accessibility tree, which is probably something we never think about. People talk about the DOM, you construct the page elements, and the kind of CSS on the same way that how CSS elements are read. Accessibility tree from what I understand, is kind of how a screen reading device, something that kind of does voiceovers or something that which you to tab or delivers the content in a different way, is trying to construct its own version of the page. Then you would think that that's just done with HTML elements and what they're labeled as, but CSS has a role in it too. Really interesting thread here from James Craig, who'd kind of made a thread about this and talked about the how CSS is involved in the construction of the accessibility tree. Some people think it's behavior's voiceover on Safari, but it's WebKit, the rendering engine. The change feedback from voiceover users in the mid to late 2000s were to use divs for everything. It was referred to as divitis. The reaction to divitis, developers started using lists for everything that could be grouped, leading to a problem we refer to as listitis, a range of lists, single item lists, irrelevant lists. So it's like, stop making everything divs, be more constructive. So people made everything as lists, but that caused the problem too, because of web developers were doing this in the name of semantic markup, but the end result, users were being shouldered with too much meaningless auditory overhead. They let us know. So I'm guessing, yeah, the voiceover then just constantly said things like to list items, end of list, list 4 items, and just constantly listing everything on the page. So the content was getting lost between these constant indicators saying this is a list items, list thing. And so as a result, they decided that we'll try and use the CSS to work out whether it's actually a list of items or it's just something that's been referenced as a list. They did a similar thing with tables. So back in the days when tables were being used for lots of ways to lay out content, there was a problem where they didn't want to keep saying like row, end of row, new row, that kind of thing. So they would have to try and work out whether it's actually a table or not by the HTML element, but by the CSS. You try and work out, without looking at it, but just reading the CSS, what is this content? Is it a table or is it just some sort of web content? Did you know, among other style-based checks, it looks for zebra stripe tables? So you're sort of saying, does each row change color? If it's a light row, dark row, that's probably doing some sort of tabular information. That's probably a table. So it's detective work on the visuals to try and work out what's going on. It's trying to work out with lists. The principle is this: if all the styles that make it list-like have been removed, then it's no longer relevant to convey it as a list. If the cited user doesn't need to know it's a list, then why would a screen reader user need to know it's a list? So things like if you're removing the bullets, image markers, if you're removing all the things that usually make something clearly defined as a list, then you're probably telling the viewer that this is not really a list, in which case we're going to start ignoring the HTML structure of a list and sort of tell these screen readers this is not a list either. Anyway, on a tangent, a lot of CSS is used to compute the accessibility tree. Many people think it's only display none and visibility hidden, but dozens if not hundreds of style characteristics contribute. So that means that as much as you'd kind of think like, well, you just write regular HTML, you use P's for paragraphs, you write lists for lists, you write headings for the right things, I'm doing the right job to just convey what my content is. But there's also, it's not as straightforward as that, in that the screen readers have some sort of legacies of issues that they're trying to look at your content and your CSS to determine how are you using those elements. Are you using them in the correct way? And if so, how can we kind of work out what you're doing based on other style rules to kind of convey the right thing? And that's a constantly moving process, because the web world is constantly changing and the elements being used by people is constantly changing. It's probably made much more murky these days by components and all these JS frameworks and tools that people use to kind of just throw loads of divs together and try and construct things and then throw some ARIA labels on things. And they're trying to sort of gamify their accessibility. It's just a strange thing. It suggests that the web is always about, we look at accessibility as often this thing about disabled people and disabilities. It's about making the web for disabled people, and people say, it's not worth putting time into accessibility, it's this percentage of people. Most people use the site in a regular way and that's fine, accessibility. Well, really, it's not. It's just this thing about how do you lay out your content and how do you describe your content and how do you build it in a very well-structured way which helps everyone, whether that's kind of about making good contrast of color, good design decisions, good layouts, good structures. And it's not always as straightforward as just I've done all the things to get the check boxes and get the thing. Gamifying accessibility might be good because if you've got a score of 40, you're going to say, look, we need to improve that, and we've got it up to 60, we've got it up to 80, and getting you 100 will be this great moment, and you probably are making improvements. But it's kind of, it's not so much a science, it's a dance. You're trying to constantly meet with this kind of language of what your content is and see that it's interpreted in the right way to make a pleasant experience for all. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting. It's it's just another video. Have fun. Please leave comments and all that stuff, and see you soon.